Question 14. Contrast how an optical microscope and a transmission electron microscope work and contrast the limitations of their use when studying cells. So when we're asked to contrast two different things, we're wanting to describe properties and to try and group them together. So in this situation, we're talking about the transmission electron microscope, and we describe how it works by saying that it uses electrons. And then straight away, we would describe how the optical microscope works. So we are contrasting the two. We are comparing and contrasting. So the transmission electron microscope uses electrons, and the optical microscope will use light. The transmission electron microscope has a greater resolution. It needs to be comparative, so we need to be saying that the resolution is greater on the transmission electron microscope, not just that it has a high resolution. It needs to be a reference of it being higher or greater. So because of this higher resolution, then the scanning electron microscope can see smaller organelles or any named cell structure, so anything smaller than a nucleus you could talk about. These can be observed with the transmission electron microscope. We can also see greater detail in these organelles, but again it needs to be a comparative. It can't just be we can see detail, it needs to be the idea that with the transmission electron microscope you can see greater detail. Then we can talk about the limitations as it asks us to do in the question. So with a transmission electron microscope we can only view dead or dehydrated specimens, whereas with an optical microscope we can see live specimens. The transmission electron microscope doesn't show any colour, it can only show black and white, whereas the optical microscope can. The transmission electron microscope requires a thinner specimen. Again, the ER is underlined, so it needs to be a comparative. You need to be stating that it has to be thinner with a transmission electron microscope than an optical microscope. The transmission electron microscope will require a more complex preparation or more time-consuming preparation. So again, the idea of it taking more time or being more complex than the optical microscope is essential. And the idea that the transmission electron microscope is going to be focused using magnets, and the optical is going to be focused using lenses. So when you're making a statement and you're answering a question that asks you to contrast answers, try and group all of the characteristics together so that you make sure that you're referring to both types of microscope when you're describing each point of how it works or the limitations. Try to do this rather than just write a list about how the electron microscope works and then how the optical microscope works, because when you write lists like that it can be easy to miss a certain point, and it might be correct what you're writing but it's not going to be a comparative answer.